Hi, Gloria. Hi, Gloria. You're muted.
Yes. Hi. Hi, Natalie.
I'm Natalie. Oh, I should put the picture on.
Yeah.
Here I am. Okay. Second, I'm going to close that closet. My messy closet. There's David.
Hello.
Hi, David.
How's it going?
Okay. A little crazy. How about you?
Yeah, okay. Same.
I
I'm
think
trying to find my text. Okay.
looks like we have a smaller group.
Small numbers have dwindled.
I know. I think people. It's just.
What's that?
It's just 8 o'clock, so you know.
Oh yeah. So it's 18, huh? There's Misha.
Erev Tov.
Shalom, shalom.
Shalom, shalom.
Hey everyone.
Hey.
Hi. What's up?
How's everyone doing?
Good. A little anxious about the election.
Yeah.
All right.
It's happening, isn't it?
Happening.
I mean, thank God it's finally here.
Seriously,
Ready to
right?
be done with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like let's just, deal with whatever it is we got to deal with.
Exactly.
But we're not going to really know tomorrow night. So I've resolved not to watch television tomorrow night.
It's probably a good
Wise.
idea.
It's really
Wise.
hard because I feel like you used to get the results the same night.
Yeah. Just as the pollsters don't want to make any commitments,
Right.
the networks don't want to, no one wants to predict any winners.
No one wants to call it. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Should we start to jump into it?
Sounds about right.
Let's do it. So hey everyone, I think so I'll kick us off. There was this one essay that was distributed by Saf Sagiv on George Steiner, which I thought was a good place to start just because he lays out he kind of beautifully lays out, I think, this issue between the cosmopolitan vision and the particularistic vision. And interestingly, last time we were talking about a little bit how Jews are othered by everybody else and forced into the particular. And there's no question truth to that. And at the same time, Jews there's a tradition of both cosmopolitanism on the one hand, and I want to get into the text to unpack what we mean by that, and also a cleaving on to a particular identity, which maybe is true for all of humanity. I don't know if there such a thing as the universal identity. We have universal principles, we have universal moral precepts. There's a whole tradition of universalism. But that often goes hand in hand with pluralism and diversity, recognizing that there's difference. So that we have universal principles or values of pluralism and diversity, if that makes any sense. So, but rather than talking about it outside the text, I thought let's dig into some excerpts from the text. I'm curious to hear what folks have to say. And then I thought we could pivot a little bit into Arendt. And hopefully that'll make a little bit of sense. And specifically, I have a passage from one of her letters to Mary McCarthy that I think is particularly apt, that I hope we can look at. And then I pulled out a few excerpts from Eichmann and Jerusalem, because I think they relate to the reflection on what do we mean by diaspora, by home, and by peoplehood, because that's the other thing we're talking about. And I see the numbers are slowly ticking up, which is nice. So does everybody have access to the text? And if you don't, maybe just gesture that you don't. And but good, it seems everybody's nodding. So let's start with a little bit of Sagiv mediating Steiner to us. And if you turn to page, let's see what page, 132. Can someone start reading with the paragraph that starts Steiner's writings reflect an unflagging? Do you guys see that?
Steiner's writings reflect an unflagging commitment to the cosmopolitan ideal, a belief of forging a common human consciousness that dissolves barriers of language, ethnicity, and territory. This view is most vividly expressed in his discussion of his own Jewish identity, the focal point of some of his most important essays. Steiner has no sympathy for the more isolationist elements of Jewish tradition, contending that such tendencies, and particularly their manifestation in Zionism and the State of Israel, quote, debase Judaism and undermine its most important qualities.
Yeah, keep going, please.
Keep going. According to Steiner, the true mission of the Jews is to be found in exile. It is to be, quote, guests among the nations, aliens who live as refugees, restless and dispossessed. Only when they are outside of their homeland, Steiner argues, have the Jews served as the cultural vanguard and moral conscience of nations, as prophets of a lofty and profound human ideal.
So that's one view of diaspora right there. Any quick reactions to that?
So he wants to eliminate, oh, okay. I guess you can say it's all in the Babylonian Talmud, not the Jerusalem Talmud. That was an exile. I mean, it just seems somewhat exaggerated.
Yeah.
You could say that the Jerusalem Talmud is the exiled one. Not that they were in exile, but that the Babylonian one is the only one we really talk about these days. And it was the same case back then. So they
At the time, that wasn't that the center of Jewish population, not just intellectual.
Exactly, yeah. The people living abroad were the majority, and the people living in the Jewish community living in Israel, they were a very small minority who were kind of at odds in the same way that we are today a little bit. There was a constant bickering between the Jewish community in Palestine and the one in Babylon. One thing that strikes me about this, he kind of calls it out a bit later, but he says cultural and moral.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's Judaism to him. The whole religious aspect is irrelevant, and it doesn't mean anything to him. He says later on,
the textual homeland versus the physical homeland. He says something about that.
Right, but the textual home, but he doesn't seem to me at home in the text in the same way that he talks about, at least the way Sagiv represents him. You know,
Mhm.
he's not someone who's at home in the text, really. He doesn't speak the language, he doesn't know all the religious stuff. He's not interested in that. He's interested in the cultural and the moral, which are certainly important elements. But Sagiv kind of calls him out for not talking from within, but always talking from without. So it's just in the context of diaspora and being
Yeah.
within or without, it's kind of an interesting.
It's
piece
very
of-
interesting. And that is such a diasporan reality of being of coming from a perspective of without. So I think it's quite relevant to again to the reflection on it. Is it worth saying something about Steiner's own personal biography?
That would be,
Yeah. Because I mean, diaspora is a real thing for him. I don't know the specifics that well, but I'm not sure if he was born in either. I think he was born in either Vienna or in France. His family is Austrian. His father decided to leave Austria to take the family to France because he thought anti-Semitism was rising in Austria. And he got that right. And so as a young child, Steiner grew up in France. And then I think his father in 1940, right before the Germans invaded France, was on some sort of mission to the US, representing the French government. And so he was actually outside of France when the Germans invaded France, and he was able to get his and from the US was able to get his family. I think Steiner was around 11 years old. He was able to get his family, I think, outside of France, and they escaped to the US. And then eventually Steiner was educated at the University of Chicago. I think he did a little bit of time at Harvard. He was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. Then he ended up teaching at University of Geneva for a long time. And then ends up, I think, in the U.S. Later in his life. But but I mention it because he is a refugee. His entire life is characterized by moving around and by flight. So he may not know the Jewish traditions and rituals or texts well, but he very well knows the Jewish experience of exile and being dispossessed. And so he is coming at it from that perspective. And he is, I mean, I think if you look at like the school that he went to in France, I think he's only one of two Jewish boys that have survived the war. So so he comes from that perspective. On page 133, just to elaborate more, I'm going to read: the Jews' achievement, he argues, consists solely in their contribution to the rest of humanity. A contribution that was made possible by the unique conditions of exile that shaped the Jewish genius over the centuries. Indeed, Steiner's cosmopolitan view of Jewish existence leaves little room for national or communal concerns. Rather, the Jews must remain true to their vocation in exile, scattered and wandering among the nations.
Must.
What's
That's
that?
prescriptive. No, it just struck me. I mean, I've read this essay carefully, but I mean, he's a brilliant literary scholar, so he's being prescriptive rather than descriptive. I'm a legal scholar and a social scientist, so there's probably a little bit more anchoring to the kind of work I've done in my career than a literary scholar would. Although I have to say, I'm sorry to say, I've never really heard of him before. It's, you know, it's sort of buried in my own little area. But I was just taken by the top of the next page where it says that his attitude reflects his own life story. So I mean, it's very autobiographical. He's writing the way from his own sense of who he is and what he can accomplish, and you know, and he speaks for himself, you know, as an intellectual who, after moving, can find a place to sit for a while to do his work. I mean, exile doesn't mean constant movement.
Yeah.
Most people, so I'm thinking sociologically, I mean, most people can't do that. So I was thinking obviously of Spinoza, who at a time when you know, there was probably a much smaller sort of roving intellectual set, but he found people he could connect with. So he had his own exile, although he didn't have to move very far, but he had a place he could express his own amazing talents. I mean, I just before we got on, I read you know, I read the Wikipedia note on Steiner, and my parents came on a boat from Geneva in 1940 as well. But you know, when your aspiration was to open a grocery store in the Bronx, you can't be in constant exile. So that's just one point, that it's very autobiographical, and that's an important. Those kinds of communities are clearly very important, but it's not for everyone. But that may be beside the point of the essay.
I really liked this piece. I thought, I don't know, I think it reflected a lot of what I feel about what it means to be Jewish. And maybe I have a sort of more cosmopolitan, romantic view of exile. But I think later they quote Rosenzweig, and he said something about being a people means something besides being rooted in a land, right? And exile kind of forced us as Jews to think about what it means to be Jewish, and to distill what's important to us, and whether it's, you know, the Torah itself, or it's certain cultural traditions, or it's a language, or because we were forced to, we really had to get to the root of what it is and how we can carry it on our backs, you know. And I think that that's kind of our power and our beauty, and also our curse. Yeah, and I was also really sympathetic to the arguments that the author made later about his about, you know, around Zionism, and about how the non-Jew defines Jews. And I thought this was a really great piece just in general.
Yeah, it's a really interesting celebration of rootlessness.
Yes.
But not, and but going even a step farther, I think, in saying there's something about rootlessness that enables a person, in this case, the Jew, to give expression to a moral stance, a moral perspective. And then
And it brings out the worst in people. Do you know what I
Yes.
mean? That it brings out the worst in non-Jews, because we have this like moralizing, this demanding of,
right.
you know, he says altruism and knowledge and these democratic principles, and it's a burden in some ways.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Jessica, you're on mute.
So it makes me also, but then I think about the first piece, the Said piece, you know, where he says, you know, sure, we have this romantic notion of exile and all these, you know, Paris and, you know, all these artists and things and writers, but, you know, that for today and in our time, exponentially more than in Said's time, even, you know, people who are in exile, and now we're not just talking about Jews, but, you know, is like you know, a mass of humanity that doesn't have this ability to, you know, set up shop somewhere or go to university and study and, you know, realize their geniuses and their talents. There's, you know, but Said wasn't specifically wasn't speaking about the Jews in exile particularly, but just the notion of exile itself and what does it mean to be forever not in your place, you know, where you come from, what you lose in that. It's you know, immigrants have faced that forever.
Mm-hmm.
You know, feeling displaced and they're the first generation feels this terrible, you know, disconnect. And then of course, as if they stay somewhere and have children, the children become assimilated and there's some kind of taste of where they came from, but it tends to diminish over time. Um, but I thought the Said piece was very powerful, kind of interesting, you know, in
Yeah.
contrast to Steiner.
There's an interesting parallel, and they're both well, they both understand something about what they think is the concept of the human or humanism. And Steiner's class explicitly talking about the importance of being a guest in the world. I think Erica was going to come in.
I was thinking just a little bit, following what Marvin was saying before. I think there's like a weird, there's this saying that like just because you found God in prison doesn't make your prison a house of God. And I feel like just because you found your genius in exile does not make exile, you know, the source, thank you, of genius. I just feel like there's some kind of like weird, not, you know, causation argument that I'm not sure I buy on the whole, like there's certainly like a Jewish I mean you get through this piece like a lot of, and I'm sorry I missed the first few minutes, so hopefully this is not repetitive, but I don't know, like there's an essentializing of what exile does that I felt was like not quite true. And it's just going to be true for some people, but much in the same way in that prison kind of example. And the other thing I was thinking about this, I think like the kind of detachment stuff is really interesting, like to manage it. And like I do like this thing about being a guest. I think about that in my work all the time. It's like you're very often a guest. Like if you think about yourself as a guest in almost any work environment, like it helps the work environment to not feel entitled to an outcome. But the other side of it is like, what is the value of all this moralizing if it doesn't seem to land when you finally got skin in the game? Like, you know what I mean? Like this idea that you're all high and mighty in the moral world, but as soon as you like put your 2 feet to the ground, you become like every other jerk around essentially. And so what does that say about your moral framework and its relevance, and how is it possible, like what comes up for me is it possible to develop a moral framework that is connected to the stakes that happen to people when they are rooted?
I think yes, but just like in an American context, like I think about, so on 135 he talks about Jews having this inescapable divine conscience of an uncompromising demand for moral elevation, for unconditional love, for total altruism, that has changed the face of mankind. And I think about like the roles of American Jews sort of at the forefront of whether it's American civil rights or women's and gay liberation or the anti-war movement or the development of sort of like socialist ideology. Like Jews have kind of been the vanguard, right? And so even if it's not for their feet landing somewhere, it's like for everyone's, for someone else's, for, do you know what I mean?
I guess I also wonder if that's true, or if that's like just Jewish, fable making. Jews at the, like, so Heschel was there. Okay, great. But that doesn't make Jews at the forefront of civil rights movement. Like, I just wonder about the narrative making of this idea of Jews as the vanguard. And I don't actually know the answer, but I definitely feel a question around it, especially this whole article brings up a question for me about like this myth or reality, but certainly this narrative of Jewish genius. Like, whoa, I was just like, slow down. I don't even know what this is.
For me, George Steiner reminded me most of all of Leopold Bloom from Ulysses, James Joyce. For James Joyce, Leopold Bloom, who's Jewish, was universal man.
Right.
The Irish people were embedded in their land, their nation, their political, ingrown, incestuous kind of being Irish and that ethnicity, and very tied to all of that. And James Joyce could only write about Ireland after he left. And I think for me, Said is very different than Steiner, because I think he is actually quite nostalgic about his loss. I don't think Steiner feels rooted to anything at all. I think his texts are literary texts. His not religious. The other thing, that there was a similarity between Steiner and Hannah Arendt, how deeply they understood Christianity as part of Western culture. That really reminded me of when I went off to college and, really confronted with something that felt very, very, very Christian, having grown up in a very Jewish family and going to a university that was not Jewish, particularly. You're confronted with the Western, knowledge and literature, and it felt very Christian. And I think George Steiner is completely immersed in it. And Hannah Arendt had a very deep understanding of Christianity. Their idea of being Jewish is very not connected at all to Jewish texts. I don't think. I mean, unless I'm missing something.
Yeah. But let's look at the on page 136, that passage about textual homeland. And I do think that, like, the other thing that Steiner has a critique of is, it seems, of Zionism in Israel, right? So actually Judaism is debased once it has a physical homeland in the form of Israel, and then it becomes a state like other states. And the moral purity, not that I think moral purity really exists in the world, but to the extent that the Jews have any moral high ground, it's lost once they're possessors of their own state, it seems, on the Steiner view. But let's look at that passage on 136. If someone can read that, that starts with this commitment.
I'll read it. This commitment to a textual homeland contrasts sharply with nationalism centered on a physical homeland, which Steiner sees as the blight of modernity. Nationalism, and with it tribalism, its primordial shade, is the nightmare of our age. Despite the fact that these are devoid of content, humans bring mad destruction down upon one another in their name. By contrast, the, quote, man of the book, unquote, is not misled by tribal, ethnic, or nationalist fantasies. He lives in a different world altogether, removed from the violence of the masses. For Steiner, the life of the spirit fosters a critical moral perspective that rejects collective bravado and subverts the oppressive authority of the national state.
And then if we look
I have a side comment on this.
yeah, let's hear it, Marvin.
It's a straw man version of nationalism. Chauvinism, extreme nationalism, uh, is one thing, but if you study history, I think one would appreciate living in a modern democratic national state. Historically, do we want to? We can't go back, right? We can't have a Jewish Commonwealth that's one of 80 nations in the Persian Empire. And there's a lot of good that for me a great vocation is to build a good nation, and that's what we'll be doing tomorrow, right, when we're voting. And then just to blow it off as nationalism is all bad is I mean it may work as a literary device for a literary scholar, but it shows ignorance of the world that I'm interested in, that I displayed with my ignorance of literary analysis.
I would say though that the like kind of postmodern response to that, like modern nationalism though, is like a world without borders and is a world without tribalisms and nationalisms. That something that is sort of larger and freer.
Yeah, I mean, I actually I don't think this is I don't think it's fair to simply dismiss it as literary, and therefore there's actually a rich tradition behind what he's talking about, which is not simply a literary tradition. It's a political tradition, it's a philosophical tradition, and there are and a moral/ethical tradition. So boundaries are not always morally defensible, right? Right? Resources are scarce, and we make decisions about who is entitled and who's not entitled to those resources. We establish boundaries, and we restrict the movement of bodies. In the same breath, we talk about human rights. Everybody's entitled to A, B, C, D, but you're not, right? So Arendt, to bring it back to her, she said the lesson of totalitarianism was, it's not enough to be a human. It's not enough to be a human. You have to have a state to have rights. He is giving expression to, you might call it otherworldly vision of a cosmopolitan right, of a universal right that attaches to you by dint of being human. And so, in a sense, and there's a paradox within the Jew. So, are the Jews like the geniuses of the world, Erica? Who knows? But what we can probably say with some confidence historically is Jews have inhabited this category of the other in the imagination of Gentiles. There's like interesting historical work that I don't know that well, but I started a book like a couple of years ago that shows even in antiquity, the Jew figuring as other in the imagination of ancient peoples who had never come face to face with Jews. And then, of course, the representation of Jews in the Christian world, and then in the Muslim world, and on and on and on. So, but the paradox of the Jew is at once the Jew as embodying some sort of universalist ideal, right? If we're really serious about humanity and being humanists and human rights, then of course we embrace the Jew, the other, because we're ultimately the same. But and the Jew's moral claim perhaps emanating from that. But on the other hand, this Jewish obsession with particularity, right? We want to maintain our difference, our distinction. We're invested in the perpetuation of our distinct nation. So he forces us to ask, why not assimilation? That seems to me like not a terrible question to ask.
He talks about it though. He says on 135, it says rejection by and separation from the Gentile community and the sense of not belonging served, in Steiner's view, as catalysts for the creative impulse in the Jewish character. In other words, you know, it's not only like it not only keeps us morally alive, it keeps us creative. The very separation that you're describing there.
Yeah. So in a sense, like he's also invested in it.
Totally.
You seem very invested.
There's an element of, I perceived a little bit of defensiveness in this. In that it's you know the never to be truly able to assimilate, because Gentiles are always going to perceive you as other. It's like, that's okay, because that makes us better, right? And this denial to me, which I think is kind of sad, of the value, this sort of demeaning of the value of just wanting a home, that's somehow inferior to being this perpetually wandering intellect out there in the world, that there's something lesser about just the human need for community and a home, and saying that, you know, if we're really going to be fulfill our role on this earth, which I have a little problem if we're really just living for the betterment of others, meaning other cultures, you know, we have to deny ourselves the things that make us happy, maybe, or content as human beings, the really pedestrian stuff that those of us who are made of flesh and blood probably want, because we need to be living for the betterment of the world. It just sounds like thou doth protest too much kind of thing to me.
I kept thinking of that Sartre line about if the Jew did not exist, the anti-Semite would invent him. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
That it's
yeah,
like,
yeah.
I just keep thinking about how like the Jew is this like necessary foil to so much of sort of like Western thought and assimilation and like monoculture, and how yeah, I don't know. I just kept thinking about like how the role isn't just for ourselves and of people, but it's like symbolic in some ways. And I'm also thinking about, like, to Linda's point, most Jews aren't from a Jewish place. Do you know what I mean? Like most Jews aren't from Israel, right? So like, but does that mean that we don't have a home, or that we don't have community, or that we don't have belonging or tradition? Like, no. It's just like, is that necessarily a nationalism? And if it is, back to Saeed's point, like, can we even go back? Like, can we even reclaim what was lost, right, in exile?
I'm
Even building on that, are we
thinking that
just living other people's perception of us by exalting it? You know, we're just like making it even more, we're exaggerating this perception of us as other, which is coming out of a place of anti-Semitism, and we're wearing it as this huge badge. Like, I don't know if I don't know.
I was thinking that the obverse to Kelly's statement from SARS is this remarkable statement early on page 133, where, according to the author, Steiner suggests the only relief for the human race may consist in the complete assimilation of the Jews and the disappearance of the Jewish people. So if you want to create, here he's trying to take them away. My side comment was that the world would benefit from the disappearance of the Jewish race is the height of Jewish self-importance and chutzpah. Is that important? I mean, really? Um,
Right, but then,
There's a
then
lot of
Sartre's
right
point
from
was
the
like, then the Jew would be reinvented.
yeah, well, or something like.
I
Yeah.
had a similar side comment of like, this is the biggest ego trip I've ever read, which made me wonder, actually, in a kind of contrast to Linda's point, but kind of similar. I have a question that the author feels so defensive of, so I'm wondering about the author of this piece. I didn't know anything about.
Yeah, I actually don't know much about him. I don't know.
Agreed.
Yeah, I don't know anything about him.
But I'm like, is he writing in defense of Israel? And kind of, is this a takedown of Steiner in defense?
That was what I assumed.
It's a
Right.
bit of a critique of, yeah. I mean, he says on page 137, just to sort of draw out a little more Steiner, and then I think he's clearly critical of it, or of Steiner. But by the top of 137, by settling in the physical homeland of Palestine, the Jews have effectively turned their backs on their textual homeland. So I don't think he's forsaking homeland, Steiner. He's just saying, why does home need to be exclusionary and consist of attachment to a particular place? We all need home, but why does it have to be this conception of home? So they've effectively turned their backs on textual homeland, exchanging the spiritual riches of exile for a piece of Middle Eastern real estate. Where it has traded its homeland and the text, this is a quote, for one of the Golan Heights or in Gaza, he writes, Judaism has become homeless to itself. Now, further down, Steiner's opposition to Zionism then stems not only from his rejection of nationalism in general, but primarily from his belief that the Zionist enterprise amounts to nothing less than a rejection of the Jews' universal calling. Jews should abandon the boring dream of security and normalcy and instead pursue the anomaly of exile, however painful it may be. So, I mean, I think the author definitely has a critique of Steiner. I want to take us to page.
Inaccurate. I mean, it doesn't
Yeah.
read like a polemic.
Okay.
I mean, I'm I come to this ignorant of
Yeah.
body of thought. It seemed, granted, it seems like a critique, but a reasonable one. What? So I'm asking you, what?
Yes. Well, I want to just. I'm not. Yeah. I there's certainly merit to the critique. But I also think that Steiner represents something, and in a sense, it's our highest aspiration as liberal universalists. And that's why I think it's important. If you look on page now 141 in the middle, well, first he starts off with this depiction of Jewish guest, but that paragraph in the middle. The unique circumstances of the Jew's existence, therefore, epitomize rootlessness to which all human beings are in truth condemned, and allow the Jew to embody the idea of human moral responsibility in the world, a position that relies on no claims of sovereignty or possession. Quote, it may be that the Jew in the diaspora survives in order to be a guest, still so terribly unwelcome at so many shut doors. Intrusion may be our calling, so as to suggest to our fellow men and women at large that all human beings must learn how to live as each other's guests in life. So
Yeah, I had a sidebar on that. I had several exclamation points saying,
why?
Maybe what you described as his personal history has to do with his viewpoints of always being on the run and being a refugee. I found what came across incredibly dispassionate. It's like, okay, you're exalting exceptionalism and assigning it to Jews, but then, you know, the whole, I don't know. I had a lot of trouble with this article, especially the end, and we're not quite there yet, but the last bit about it's Jews' fault that, Nazis wanted to exterminate them. So that kind of grabbed me a little bit. But I felt, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say the way that Steiner's biography affected the lens through which he looked at his Jewish identity, I don't think is any different. He was influenced by Heidegger and Hegel and these ideas of the Jew, vis-a-vis Christianity. I don't think is any different than Herzl's viewpoint of Judaism as an exile and how he imagined the Israeli national project. I think we're all informed by our personal histories and our stories. And I don't think that it's a bad thing necessarily.
I think that, one of the things is that, Judaism or Jewish people it's not a monolithic thing. So there's, all kinds of Jews who feel all different, understand their Judaism in all different ways. And then nationalism is also a double-edged sword. And I'm sorry, I forgot your name. Is it Marvin? Yeah,
Marvin?
yeah. What you said, that you believe, you dedicate your work is to make a democratic a nation state, and without a nation state, without citizenship somewhere, you have zero rights, and there's millions of people today with no citizenship and no even prospect of having one, exiles and refugees. But nationalism is this double-edged sword, and this great philosopher Eric Goodkind, he said the three, in writing in 1930s, he said the three blind alleys of human existence are nationalism, religion, and ideology. So yeah, building a strong, a national nation, a democratic nation state where people have rights is a great project. But then there's this, and then Said talks about how exile and nationalism are two different sides of the same coin, and that, and that the nationalism project for, it can also be a murderous machine. And when we see, this outcome today of Israel as a state, it's kind of certainly discouraging, to say the least. But it doesn't mean that's, there's not just one thing that's national. I mean, it depends, like most things, it has two sides to it. It depends on how it's used and for what purpose, of course. And then I just wanted to say that aren't I'm ignorant to a certain extent, but the Hasidim, or in Israel, I think there are some of them who never who never gave their credence. They were against an Israeli state, even when they're living in Israel. But am I not right? Is that correct?
Yeah, well, they believe God commands them to live in Israel, this physical place, but that the project of nationalism or the project of the state isn't for them to participate in, or isn't for them to dictate, right? And so they're we'll live here, whether it's Ottoman or Palestine or Israel, or we're commanded to live in this place, right?
Okay.
I just want to say that I take David's critique of my critique. Of course, universal ideals, I suppose, going back to Pax Romana. I just a week ago finished East-West Street about the Jews who created the concept of so I'm sure many of you read it years ago, of genocide and universal human rights. But yes, those are one important ideals that have to be taken into consideration in moving forward on forms of governance. Right now, we're in a world of nation states, and improving them is important. But going back to the author's point on page 141 about Steiner saying that Jews I guess he's again being prescriptive, should be in a state of exile and being guests someplace so that we can contribute to the world, is a little bit like, being a great humanist who doesn't like individual people. The cost that imposed on Steiner and his family and my own family is horrific. And so
Yeah.
as a
I think it's sort of like, why on the backs of the Jews? We get the universal aspiration, and most people care for their closest relations before they care for all of man or humankind. So why, and basically what you're saying is, forget home for the Jews, let them be in exile so that we can defend this universalist, disembodied aspiration, dispossessed of any land. I want to shift gears quickly to Hannah Arendt.
I say one thing though to Marvin.
Yeah, and then Erica, read the Arendt.
I know. The piece about us being in service of others, it's like deeply anti-Semitic. I don't know. It's just like that's like there's no inherent dignity for Jews just to live. I think it's your point, Linda, right? About being
Yes.
pedestrian.
Completely.
Yeah.
Why did we get held to the higher standard? It's not because we necessarily deserve to be.
It's a higher standard.
I don't
lower
have that kind of
standard.
ego. Everybody, it's because you put somebody up on a pedestal and then you can throw rocks at them.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm gonna read this. Okay.
So read this. It's can you see my screen?
You got it. However, Hannah Arendt, in a letter to Mary McCarthy dated October 17th, 1969. However, the main point is, of course, the survival business. And this is twofold. One very potent factor is the survival passion which has possessed this people since antiquity and has actually made it survive. The whole legislation of Ezra and Nehemiah has no other goal, and God knows it succeeded. The second factor is, of course, Israel itself and the fear that there may be another Holocaust. The argument: you need Israel in case another catastrophe happens in the diaspora, and because anti-Semitism is eternal, etc., is specious. The Jews actually are as afraid of complete assimilation as they are of extermination. Ben-Gurion, probably the most intelligent one of the older generation, once said something to the effect that he hopes his sons will die in Israel, but that he has little hope that this will be true for his grandsons. If you then ask, why then do you try this nearly hopeless business? The answer, that is really the Jewish answer, is a second catastrophe after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD will do for the coming centuries or perhaps millennia what the first did in the past. The memory will keep the people together. Oh, the people will survive. This is au fond all that matters. Jews think empires, governments, nations come and go. The Jewish people remains. There is something grand and something ignoble in this passion. I think I don't share it, but even I know that any real catastrophe in Israel would affect me more deeply than almost anything else. She's a genius. What the hell?
She is, eh?
Yeah.
So let's continue. Let's read a little bit more Arendt, because now from Eichmann and Jerusalem, I picked out a few passages. We probably don't have time to go into all of it. But I actually think that Eichmann in Jerusalem is in part a big treatise on the question of home, and can we be at home in the world, and if we can, what does it mean?
Do you want me to keep reading?
Yeah, please.
For when I speak of the banality of evil, I do so only on the strict factual level, pointing to a phenomenon which stared one in the face at the trial. Eichmann was not Iago and not Macbeth, and nothing would have been farther from his mind than to determine with Richard III to prove a villain. Except for an extraordinary diligence in looking out for his personal advancement, he had no motives at all. He merely, to put the matter colloquially, never realized what he was doing. It was sheer thoughtlessness, something by no means identical with stupidity, that predisposed him to become one of the greatest criminals of that period. And if this is banal and even funny, if with the best will in the world one cannot extract any diabolical or demonic profundity from Eichmann, this is still far from calling it commonplace. that such remoteness from reality and such thoughtlessness can wreak more havoc than all the evil instincts taken together, which perhaps are inherent in man. That was, in fact, the lesson one could learn in Jerusalem. Keep going.
Yeah, please.
Evil comes from a failure to think. It defies thought, for as soon as thought tries to engage itself with evil and examine the premises and principles from which it originates, it is frustrated because it finds nothing there. That is the banality of evil.
And I think, yeah, if you don't, yeah.
Just go up a sec, yeah. And just as you supported and carried out a policy of not wanting to share the earth with the Jewish people and the people of a number of other nations, as though you and your superiors had any right to determine who should and who should not inhabit the world, we find that no one, that is, no member of the human race, can be expected to want to share the earth with you. This is the reason, and the only reason, you must hang. For the lesson of such stories is simple and within everybody's grasp, but politically speaking, it is that under conditions of terror, most people will comply, but some people will not. Just as the lesson of the countries to which the final solution was proposed is that it could happen in most places, but it did not happen everywhere. Humanly speaking, no more is required, and no more can reasonably be asked for this planet to remain a place fit for human habitation.
Wow. That last paragraph seems particularly timely.
Yeah.
Given the world that we continue to inhabit. Yeah. So, Marvin, it's interesting to reflect on your thinking about the nation state and nationalism. And her observation that under conditions of terror, so the starting point of a state, I'm not saying states don't equate to terror or evil, but states are all exclusionary. There's no state that is all inclusive, then it ceases to be a state. There has to be a boundary. And there's always equality among those who count as equals. So, but this line about under conditions of terror, most people will comply. Most people will comply. But some people will not. Just as the lessons of the countries in which the final solution was proposed, that it could happen in most places, but it didn't happen everywhere. And that enough is enough. And just that there were 10 righteous makes the planet a place fit for human habitation. There's again something that's the theme of the possibility of being at home.
I always think about the countries that were like invaded by Germany but didn't turn over Jews, and how the countries that were most enthusiastic collaborators of the Nazis were the ones that already had these like deep traditions of anti-Semitism, and how like it was just a continuation of the story. Do you know what I mean? How like you know, like how they kind of went hand in hand, and how the Nazis just capitalized on what was kind of already there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
As the son of a Bulgarian Jew, let me just say it's complicated.
Yeah, of course. I mean,
Leave it there.
Yugoslavia, I mean, yes,
There are
of
books
course.
on.
I mean, I think this brain science stuff is interesting. Evil comes from a failure to think.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I mean, when I've worked with some people who've committed homicide in my work, and a lot of the times what's hard about what they express is this to me, from what I've seen, thoughtlessness is the primary motivator of the homicides that I've kind of come into contact with, which are very few. This is very anecdotal and certainly not social science or any kind of research, but anecdotally, this speaks to a lot of the kind of horrific violence that I've seen. It's this failure to think, and that is connected to, you know, a lot of the times there's this like feeling of a threat. I feel threatened, and then I act, and I don't think in between the feeling of being threatened and the act. And so when I read this Eichmann in Jerusalem, that was what was really overcoming for me, was like, it's most of the time thoughtlessness, and it's more this, like, when you get thoughtfulness, that's this kind of beautiful, miraculous kind of thing. Because if you can overcome kind of that lizard part of your brain and actually think.
I think that's partially what scares me about Jewish nationalism and Zionism, is that if Jews are all in Israel, right? And if Israel is all Jews, then people don't really have to deal with us. People don't really have to think about the Jewish problem. People don't really have to contend with having this other in their midst if we're just not there and we're assigned a place and we don't belong elsewhere, because then we officially don't belong elsewhere. I don't know.
A really good point, Kelly.
Well, I think Hannah Arendt is saying something really profound about otherness, and in a way she makes it really hard to completely other evil because it's so banal. And Eichmann's interests are so mundane and relatable to anybody who just wants to get by in the world and get better in the world and do a little better. So I think she makes it really complicated, because she doesn't make it that easy to see evil over there. I think she makes us.
Well, yeah, I mean, Eichmann was just an ambitious bureaucrat.
Right.
Right?
And it could be anybody.
It could be anybody.
Yeah.
Exactly. So this is, I mean, Erica, you brought up the folks you work with who've committed homicide, but I can see this like in the bureaucracy where I work, that people are ambitious and they're playing by a certain set of rules and they're thoughtless in their ambition. And it's about, he writes it here, personal advancement. Or it's what we see, I think, in much of the social media universe these days, which is a great deal of thoughtless efforts at personal advancement. So yeah, there's a commonality to evil. It's commonplace in certain respects. And what becomes exceptional then is to think and to reflect. And if you look at, this comes out especially during election season, as the different parties, what are they trying to do? They're trying to stir people's emotions and passions. It's not the campaign is not about urging people to think. It's something else. Yeah, Natalie.
This paragraph, I come back to that part where Hannah Arendt speaks about language, and that what remains for her is her language, and it's not the German culture per se or the German nation, but it's the language of creativity, the language of poetry and all that. Whereas Eichmann was banal he lived in a world of cliche. It was just officialese. It was the bureaucratic ease of what you had to say and do in order to rise through the hierarchy. And that's true in a lot of, I've witnessed it in the corporate world as well. You just kind of use the lingo of the company, and you adapt to the cultural, mores of the company. And that's very different. She calls it propaganda, and to some extent that's what it is, but that Eichmann was unable to escape that he was just so caught up in that officialese that was so banal that he could conduct all kinds of atrocities.
And just to carry that maybe a little different direction, maybe what Arendt is calling the banality of evil, perhaps she's mixing up, a kind of a defensive narrative of, oh, we're just bureaucrats, and we have a story we tell ourselves that removes us from the moral heinousness and atrocities we're doing, but that somewhere there is that awareness, and she's hearing the rationalizations, the bureaucratic rationalizations that these people speak to live with themselves. I mean, that's just another thought about it. Perhaps it isn't all the banality that's just on the surface.
Something that I keep coming up against is there's research that suggests, as far as I know, David, you probably know more about this, that she was wrong about Eichmann, that he wasn't so banal, that he was actually a real Jew hater. And that's kind of what they discovered later on when they picked him up in Argentina and everything. So I guess I'm feeling and on the other hand, I guess I look at a line like this stuff about thinking, and I'm thinking about the entire state of Israel currently that is refusing to think about what it's doing. Not the entire state, but a large percentage. The type of news that it is witnessing is not the news that they don't know. They don't actually see very much what's happening there. And on the other hand, every community actually is caught up in the specific view that it's seeing, and refusing to integrate the other components of the situation. It's a refusal to think. It's not a failure to think. It's a refusal. Everybody is caught in this in this refusal to actually contemplate
The consequence of the direction.
yeah, and the easy thing to do, the very hard thing. I'm thinking about this guy who, or I don't know if it was a man or a woman, the 20-year-old who you spoke to yesterday. Erica was in Pennsylvania trying to get people to vote, and there was a 20-year-old she was talking to who was like totally conflicted, didn't know who to vote for, and you seemed kind of frustrated about it, but I found it kind of admirable. I couldn't help inside of me to have an admiration for actually not being so fully in the world bubble that within which I exist. There's something that has to do, and that's diaspora, right? Diaspora,
Yeah.
to be free from the patterns that you are, right? It's we're away from our home, we're away from our attachments. We're reading Lech Lecha this week, leave your father's house, right? Leave that thought place and find some independence, for Christ's sake.
Yeah. Be uncomfortable, be a stranger, be a guest. Like, why the refusal to think? Edward Said, remember, he starts off his article by saying how exile is tantamount to suffering, but then he wouldn't trade it in for anything. It's also, it's the greatest triumph when done well. And in a sense, and Steiner is also celebrating a certain tradition of critical thinking and distance and struggle. And I think Arendt, it's a version of something. It's not the same thing, but it is a call to thinking, and she's very well acquainted with the vicissitudes of thinking. So it's not from a place of be comfortable and calm and think. Thinking is a struggle, but it's also, without that struggle, we're all capable of being Eichmanns.
James, can I ask you a question? Because I'm listening to you. When I read Steiner and Arendt, the two articles you recommended, I thought that there was a heavy emphasis on individualism or an individuality or interior processes of, knowing one's mind, but not very much about the collective, unless I missed it. But it seemed to emphasize, I may not have completely understood it, but there did seem to be not much about the collective. And so I was just curious if you had any thoughts about that.
Does anyone have any thoughts? I mean, I think, yeah, I think you're right. It's not, well, I don't know what you mean exactly by the collective.
But I think like exile and diaspora is like diaspora, I guess I think of as more collective, like a people being spread around. But to be an exile, to be an outsider is like necessarily kind of internal, kind of personal, kind of how you deal with it, and the thinking and the feeling is a personal experience, right? Like we see all these varied perspectives on exile, even though they're all Jews from Germany, right? Like it's all of the same ilk, but it's like wildly different perspectives.
Yeah, it makes me think of Said talking about how lonely exile is.
Yes.
There's something isolated and lonely. Of course, we're also, yeah, we're community seeking and community building and community participating at times, not always.
Well, I'd go back to the point I made earlier that he had a community. It was a small community of intellectuals existing in universities, in Europe and the US. But for most people, you simply cannot find a community. And, millions of Americans find community in football stadiums.
So I think, yeah, we're past time, and I want to be mindful of that. But I'm reminded of this exchange between Hannah Arendt and Gershom Scholem, in which he lays into her a bit in terms of her love of the Jewish people. And she says, I don't love the Jewish people, I love my friends. But it's not so straightforward. You saw that passage in the letter she wrote to Mary McCarthy about how devastating it would be if something catastrophic happened to Israel. Which, by the way, I think that's another expression we're seeing in diaspora in the last year. A lot of people who had very thin relationships, connections to the state of Israel, and maybe upset as well by how the state has comported itself in the year plus since October 7. They're also extremely sensitive to the fate of this particular state and what might happen. And the prospect of its dissolution is also very scary. Anyway, I don't think, Gloria, that I've been able to answer your question. It's not an either or.
Yeah.
But I think it's in a sense, it's the home exile dialectic. It's the collective individual person group.
Yeah. Yeah. So Hannah Arendt, even though she eschews nationalism, I think, has this, strong emotional sort of connection to Israel. Like she would deeply mourn any harm that came to it. So yeah.
Yeah.
It's complicated. And
it's complicated. Yeah. On that note, we've all got some meditating to do.
Thank you so much for this discussion.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Go vote if you haven't voted.
Yes. And urge others to do the same.
If people are
Thank you
freaking
so
out,
much. Good evening.
if people are freaking out, I'm doing 2 things tomorrow on Zoom. We got a relatively traditional short prayer at 8:30 in the morning, and then a meditation session at 5:30 in the afternoon.
Perfect.
So I think you guys should be on the
Yeah.
on the email list, so the Zoom links there. But if not, feel free to write to in between phone banking. Erica is adding.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
Thank you.
you.
It's an interesting read.
Bye-bye.
Bye.